I came to the study of Ben-Gurion really not the way most authors come to Ben-Gurion, and that is I came from the outside in rather than the inside out. Most people who've written about Ben-Gurion are primarily interested in the history of the State of Israel, the history of Zionism. I came to Ben-Gurion in a different way, as a student of war decision-making, and in particular, civilian leadership at the highest echelons in wartime. And so I have the chapter of this book, Supreme Command. Ben-Gurion is a fascinating figure as a man who was both idealized and also demonized. And one of the things that's interesting about him is that very much as with Churchill and indeed even Abraham Lincoln, the pendulum of revisionist writing has really swung pretty hard against him. And in particular, I would say recent Israeli writers have been fairly unkind, and there's a reason for that. The right never forgave him for the Altalena affair, for the sinking of an arms ship carrying both weapons but also fighters for the Irgun Tzvai Leumi coming to Israel and actually in the middle of the War of Independence. The left never liked him. The hard left never liked him because he was quite deeply anti-communist and deeply mistrustful of the Soviet Union. The soft left never liked him because they thought he was a militarist. Sephardic writers recently have viewed him as part of that patronizing Ashkenazic elite that dominated the state of Israel and felt that they never got much respect from him. Religious nationalists of late have not particularly cared for him. He was a secular man, although not entirely. By the way, I'm going to quibble a little bit about his position on the Book of Eicha. A man who had a largely secular conception of the state, and who was certainly, particularly towards the end of his life, quite cautious about the idea of expanding Israeli territory, though that actually goes back even earlier to the War of Independence. And that's one of the reasons why we really only have two quite short biographies of Ben-Gurion. We have one, quite a recent one by Anita Shapira, and an older one by Michael Bar-Zohar. He really deserves the kind of massive biography that, say, Margaret Thatcher has recently received from Charles Moore, and he's never gotten it. Well, what I want to do is, I believe Ben-Gurion was a truly great man, and I want to explore that greatness by looking at Ben-Gurion in the truly critical period of Israel's creation, particularly during the War of Independence. Let me first say something, though, about Ben-Gurion the man. Ben-Gurion had two houses. He had a real house in Tel Aviv, which some of you may have had the chance to visit. I urge you to do so. There's a museum, but you get to see his house, which tells you a lot about him. And then he had what he called his tzrif, his little hut in the Negev at the kibbutz of Sde Boker. When you go into Sde Boker, you'll see there are the images of only 4 human beings in the tzrif, and they tell you an enormous amount about him. On his desk, there's a photograph of Beryl Katznelson, who was an old friend of his from the labor movement, who everybody loved, unlike Ben-Gurion, who most people didn't like. There's a little reproduction of Michelangelo's Moses. When you walked into the tiny, tiny sitting room, you see a portrait of Lincoln done in a micrograph of the Emancipation Proclamation, and in his bedroom, a photograph of Mahatma Gandhi. You know, I think you learn a lot from people by saying, okay, who are their heroes? Who do they want to decorate their home or their house with? And I think those 4 characters actually tell you a lot about Ben-Gurion. He was a complicated and contradictory man. He was influenced by his Jewish background, which was deep in many ways, but also by his voracious appetite for general culture. And I'm going to say a lot more about that. Not a religious Jew, but his Hebrew is salted with all kinds of phrases from the Tanakh, and it does make a difference to read Ben-Gurion in Hebrew because you realize that Tanakh is just coming through all the time. An incredible reader. His library, total library, his house is what I would like my house to be if my wife would let me. It's all bookshelves. It's all floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, all of it. There's a couple of tables where there's some knickknacks, but that's what it is, both the House and the Tzrif. 12,000 volumes in 10 languages. Now, he only knew 8 pretty well. Russian, Polish, Hebrew, Yiddish, English, a little bit less good Turkish, Arabic, French, and German, although he was learning ancient Greek at the end. As a husband and father, pretty terrible. He cheated on Paula, who had frequently had to starve himself or herself in order to keep the kids fed, and that's because he was spending every spare cent on books, quite literally. Didn't have many real friends, I would argue. Katznelson was really probably the only really close friend that he had, although he had a lot of subordinates who were absolutely devoted to him and who he was very close to, but in terms of peer relationships, not a whole lot. So what made him a great statesman? We tend to think of statesmanship, I believe, in terms of vision, which is true, some sort of great picture of the future that somehow brings other people along to believe in it. But statesmanship lies in many other things as well, in a mastery of detail, and a sense of timing, and awareness of limits. And what I want to do is illustrate that by talking about Ben-Gurion's statecraft in the critical period of his career, the winning of Israeli independence, because although he was surrounded undoubtedly by some remarkable men and women, there is no question that he is the founding father of the Israeli state. Israeli independence, or the emergence of the Israeli state, I think goes through 3 critical periods, in each of which he plays an important role, and I'm going to talk mainly about the last one. The first is roughly the decade from the outbreak of the Arab revolt in Palestine in 1936 through the end of World War II, to 1946, and to the basic British decision to leave Palestine. The second phase is from April of 46 for about a year and a half until November of 1947. That's between the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, which basically really puts the idea of a Jewish state on the table in terms of what the great powers want, to the UN vote, which basically gives the go-ahead for Israeli independence. And then the third, of course, is from that vote of November 29th, 1947, all the way through the War of Independence, January of 1949. Now, in the first phase, that decade of violence from 36 to 46, that is the moment that convinced the British, but also the Zionists, most emphatically including Ben-Gurion, that Arab opposition to the Zionist project would be deep, pervasive, and enduring. That's the point where Ben-Gurion in particular reconciled himself to the idea that if there was to be an independent Jewish state, it was going to have to be in the teeth of Arab resistance. It's also, by the way, what convinces the British in a variety of ways that they should try to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine and perhaps even prevent the creation of an Arab state. Of course, it's followed by the catastrophe of the Holocaust, a crisis which also bred opportunity, at least as Ben-Gurion saw it. There's a reason why Ben-Gurion comes in the spring of 1942 to the United States, and in May of 1942 famously issues the Biltmore program. And so that's basically when the Jewish community in Palestine, the Yishuv, declares the objective is statehood. And that was very much a Ben-Gurion's decision. It was by no means the unanimous view of his colleagues in the Jewish agency. That second crisis was the crisis of partition, where it was clear that there was going to be some sort of partitioned state, partition between the Arabs of Palestine and the Jews. There, I think Ben-Gurion saw much more clearly than anybody else did that that could go wrong in a number of ways too. First, that the state that could be created would simply not be viable. Second possibility, that the state or a large part of it could be internationalized. Or thirdly, the creation of a binational state, which Ben-Gurion also thought were doomed. And throughout that period, he's fighting very much against those 3 possibilities. What I really want to focus, though, on is the third phase, which is the War of Independence. And that war itself is extraordinarily complex. It, of course, includes not one, but really two wars with the Arabs. One war with the Arabs of Palestine, that's in the first phase. And the second war is the war against the Arab states. And that is compounded by two other struggles, all of which Ben-Gurion plays the central role. One is a very high-level geopolitical game that he's playing with the British, with the United States, and with the Soviet Union. And the third, a tremendous internal struggle against the right, in the shape of the revisionists, the hard left, particularly in the form of Mapam, the really left-wing party, and the Palmach, which I'll say more about, and a bunch of, as who should say, Meshuggahs. So three complex conflicts. Having given you a very, very brief chronology, let me try to isolate the qualities that I think Ben-Gurion demonstrated, which really do make him one of the world's great statesmen. The first is simply his ability to look at things through a very wide lens. And I keep on thinking about those 12,000 books. One of the problems with, I know certainly the version of Israeli history that I got at a very good day school, let it be said, is that it's really just completely focused on the Jews. Of course, as it was lived, it was anything but. Ben-Gurion was acutely conscious that at the time that, for example, the British are trying to restrict immigration in the late 1930s, that is very much driven by things like the Ethiopian crisis, German rearmament, and the prospect of war. That the white paper, the infamous white paper of May 1939, coincides with the end of the Spanish Civil War and the emergence of the Italo-German alliance. The timing of the Biltmore program has a lot to do with the collapse of the British Empire's position in Asia. The British deciding to finally give up the mandate in February of 1947, driven very much by the predicament of the British economy, which Ben-Gurion was very familiar with because he spent a lot of time there. And finally, he's acutely conscious in May of 1948 that the state of Israel is emerging at the same time that you have the Soviets really extending their sway in Eastern Europe, particularly to Czechoslovakia, which becomes the most important source of arms for the new Israeli state. From the outset, Ben-Gurion was an Israeli statesman who looked out. He believed, this becomes actually stronger in the 50s and 60s, but even felt it at the time, that Israel would not be able to make it if it did not have the support of at least one great power. This is one of the reasons why in '67, as an 80-year-old man, he really shakes Yitzhak Rabin, who was then chief of staff of the Israeli army, and practically gives the poor man a nervous breakdown because he thinks that the pre-'67 crisis is a disaster because Israel is internationally isolated. Where I think you really see his grasp of international politics, though, was in his resolution to press for independence in that period from the end of '47 through 1948. He understood, and in a quite a sophisticated way, which we can talk about, that that was the moment where you could imagine an Israeli state being created because of the configuration of international politics, not just because of the circumstances on the ground. He was acutely conscious of where the Americans are, where the Soviets are, where the British are. Those are the three big players. And almost as remarkable, he was aware of how that constellation could turn deeply unfavorable in a moment. So in September 1948, when things are going pretty well for the Israelis, he says, "We can win in war and strike our enemies and smash the armies of Abdullah in Syria and Iraq and Egypt and drive them from the land, and we can still lose the diplomatic battle if, as a result, we create decisive state interests against us in the rest of the world." So his whole statecraft, which is in part inward-looking, is also profoundly outward-looking. A second quality that he had was his willingness to step back and reconsider fundamental issues, not on the basis of instinct, which is how we often think of great statesmen operating, but on the basis of inquiry. And I spent quite a bit of time on this in on my chapter in Ben-Gurion. In December 1946, since the mid-30s, Ben-Gurion had been the chairman of the Jewish Agency Executive. So he's the de facto prime minister, if you can, I use that term very lightly, of the parallel state that was the Jewish Agency. But in December 1946, he takes on what became known as the Tika Bitachon, the defense portfolio. And what he does from the end of March to the end of May 1947 is he suspends all of his other responsibilities, and he conducts what he calls the seminar, which consists of interviewing everybody who's a senior officer in the Haganah. He talks to all kinds of economics experts. He talks to all kinds of political figures. He brings them in for one-on-one interviews, and the whole time he's just sitting and writing in his diary. He kept this amazing diary, and actually the diary for the War of Independence has been published in Hebrew in a 3-volume edition, which is quite remarkable. And at the end of it, when it's all wrapped up, he gives this speech, which did not go down well. You will remember that Israel had the Haganah, which is sort of the underground militia. It had the Palmach, which was a smaller, much smaller elite set of units, mainly based on the kibbutzim, quite left-wing in orientation because of the kibbutzim that they were affiliated with, which was sort of the elite units, the Plugot Machats, the strike companies. So he gives this speech. In the Palmach, we have made great advances, but even they will not stand the test of real military operations. They are not adequately trained, and their commanders are not either. On the first occasion, there will be a terrible and awful failure. I know I'm saying some very hard things. In my heart are even harder views, and therefore I'm going to say only the minimum. We have to start everything virtually afresh, because the Arab front is becoming serious. It's no longer a front composed merely of bandits. There is an organized Arab world, states, armies. Of course, as compared to European armies, they have no value. But compared to a non-army, they have value. And what we have is a non-army. We have to do some very difficult things. We have to uproot from the hearts of men who are close to the matter the belief that they have something. They have nothing. They have goodwill, they have hidden capacities, but they have to have professional knowledge. To make a shoe, you have to be a trained cobbler. So what elicited this? Basically, what the conclusion that Ben-Gurion came to was that the Haganah was a very good adaptation to one set of problems, and that was the problem of maintaining security against the Palestinian Arabs, some of whom actually were fairly formidable as guerrillas on their own, but they weren't ready to deal with the Arab states. He thought Israeli military leaders were thinking too small, say in company-sized units of 100 soldiers or so. Ben-Gurion says we have to begin thinking in terms of brigades, several thousand soldiers, with artillery and radios and all kinds of stuff. Moreover, he was appalled by just how parochial the leadership of the Haganah and the Palmach were. He was particularly appalled by the fact that there had been no effort to recruit from the pool of roughly 20,000 veterans of the British Army then living in Palestine. And the reason for that, as he correctly identified, was this sort of antipathy between the indigenous leadership of the Haganah and the Palmach, who looked on people who had gone to serve in the British Army as people who weren't really kind of hanging around and defending the home front, which is where their duty should have kept them. By the way, he did this again in 1953, the same sort of pulling back completely, spending a couple of months. That also, I can talk about that. It also had some very interesting conclusions. Ben-Gurion was not sentimental. If there was an institution that he was committed to throughout his career, it was the Israel Defense Forces. He really is the father of the IDF. And within the IDF, I think he is still to this day viewed in that way. Literally the only kind of ornamentation that you will find in his house or in the tzrif, books aside, are plaques and memorabilia from the Israeli army. That's all there is, or pictures of him visiting troops and things like that. This is what he says about the IDF, June 1948. The essence of an army's existence is not democratic, not humane, not Zionist, and not socialist, because an army exists for killing and destruction. Men with weapons have a power that others do not. They are a perpetual danger to the community and to themselves. We have to see things as they are in all their cruel brutality, and we should not forget this: man is not an angel. All flesh and blood are likely, in the right circumstances, to exploit their superiority and force if they are not in a framework to prevent this exploitation. And so Ben-Gurion really devoted himself, an enormous amount of his work, to establishing a framework of civilian control of the IDF. And that was one of his most important legacies, that with this tremendous love that he had for the army that he created, he was also always extremely wary of it. Ben-Gurion was a pragmatist. He was willing to cut a deal with just about anybody. If you look at the coalitions that he builds as prime minister, he's willing to have anybody in there. Actually, before the war, he was quite willing to negotiate with Zev Jabotinsky, with whom he actually got along personally quite well. But he actually got more pushback from his colleagues in the Sochnut than he would have exercised on his own. Quite willing to negotiate with the British up to the very end. Willing to negotiate, obviously, with any of the Arabs. On the other hand, he would take advantages where they found them. Thus, for example, he was very much against the idea of deliberately expelling Palestinian populations during the war, except in a couple of cases which were really designed to kind of help protect the road to Jerusalem. But once there was this quite substantial movement of Palestinians away out of villages, he said, that doesn't mean we have to bring them back. June 1948. We won't make any decisions about what will happen after the war, because everything depends on how the war ends. But how the war will end depends largely on what happens now, in the days of the truce. This is the middle of one of the truces, the first truce, which was really important. So he was a in many ways, very flexible guy, except on two things. One was the existence of the State of Israel, and the other, interestingly, was the centrality of having Jerusalem at its heart. One of the first big decisions that he makes is that at the very outset of the war, that the Jewish garrison of Jerusalem had to be sustained no matter what, and that he'd be willing to take losses in the south and in the north, so long as Israel could hang on, at least to the western part of Jerusalem. And of course, this pragmatism culminates after independence in his willingness to accept German reparations, something which a lot of people also never forgave him for. Begin, I think, always felt it was a mistake. In retrospect, I think most economists would tell you was one of the most important things for the Israeli state was the scale of German reparations, but also for the Israeli army. A lot of the first modern American weapons that the Israelis get are from the Germans. We're getting French arms in the 50s and even some British arms. The first American arms actually come in through the Germans. He had a vision of the state. The word he used was mamlachtiyut, statishness, I suppose. And although he was a socialist, that mattered more than anything else. But it was not just an idea. He had to take some very hard steps to create state institutions. And again, I'll come back to the army. He was deeply fearful of the idea of politicized military organizations, and that explains the ferocity with which he went after first the revisionist organization, Etzel, the Irgun Tzvai, but also Lehi, Lochamei Yisrael, the so-called Stern Gang. There is, of course, as I said, the famous Altalena episode, in which, at that point, the State of Israel had already been declared. This is in late June of 1948. It was a ship that had been acquired before independence, filled with arms, also a lot of fighters who had been trained in Europe by Etzel. Ben-Gurion was uncompromising. He says that ship has to be turned over completely to the IDF. Etzel made an effort to say, well, we want to reserve a percentage of the weapons and certainly the troops to go fight in Jerusalem, which was the last area where there was a distinct Etzel unit. And as I'm sure you all know, he orders Palmach units led by a young officer named Yitzhak Rabin to open fire on the Altalena in, I think, 18 people are killed, and the ship is lost. Ben-Gurion completely uncompromising on this one, and one of the more less diplomatic things he said that, he had, after the war, no regrets whatsoever about that. And he said, and when the third temple is built, HaTotach HaKadosh, the holy cannon, which opened up on the Altalena, will be next to the altar. As I said, not very diplomatic. But he also went against the left. The Israeli army consisted of roughly 10 field brigades plus sort of home defense units by the end of the War of Independence, 3 of which were Palmach brigades, which were by and large more motivated and somewhat more effective, although we can go back and forth on that one. The Palmach had its own headquarters and its own general staff, and Ben-Gurion was determined to break it up. And what he does is he breaks it up in pieces. First he goes after the high command, then he goes after the separate units. And the Palmach, by the way, was dominated by Mapam, in whose kibbutzim you would see big portraits of Comrade Stalin. It was a pretty hard left organization. And what Ben-Gurion did, what he always did, which is he chooses a moment just before a truce is about to end and all hell is about to break out to make his move. So he dissolves it October 7th, 1948, just before the truce on the southern front with Egypt is about to end. And then actually after independence, he purges the IDF of some of the leading Palmach officers, with the exception of people like Rabin, who he rather liked, and he replaces them mainly with British-trained officers. I think from what I've said, you can see another trait or pair of traits I'd like to mention, which is ruthlessness. This was a ruthless guy, but also a moderate guy. And I think one of the characteristics of great statesmen is they know when to be ruthless and when to be moderate. I'm not talking about personal relationships, because this was not an easy man to deal with. He was ruthless. He was willing to work with the British in late 44, early 45, and what was called the Season, where basically the Haganah ends up cooperating with the British in arresting some members of particularly Lehi, but also Etzel. He is willing to pull these stunts where, in order to get what he wants, he will threaten to quit just before a truce is over. And there's one actually at the end of the first truce, which was really the critical one, when they're rebuilding and the war is about to restart. And there's been a kind of a big committee of investigation, the Grunbaum Committee, and they conclude, Ben-Gurion should stay as Minister of Defense, but he should really have this kind of council of 5 wise men to advise him. And they said that's a reasonable compromise, so that way we keep Ben-Gurion, but we don't have to, we have some control on him. And Ben-Gurion does it literally the day before the truce ends. He says, sure, I quit. And they go like that, and he's in. By the way, this is also true, I think, with his, he is moderate in other ways. So for example, he makes the decision in 49 when there's a point where the IDF probably could have taken at least the southern half of the West Bank. And they actually had a plan to take Hebron, and he decides not to do it, even though he's being pressed by some of his military subordinates. So the idea would be to take Hebron, and then you can take Jerusalem, take the rest of Jerusalem, the eastern part. And he says no, because he's afraid of a conflict with the British. And he says, I know this is B'chiyah l'dorot. This will be a cause of weeping for generations. But given where we are in the world, that's what we better do. And throughout his whole political career, this was a man who would fight very hard for his half a loaf, but he knew how to be satisfied with half a loaf. Let me conclude by just saying a few things about Ben-Gurion's legacy. Obviously, the existence and survival of the State of Israel. Was it a miracle? And I have to say that I'm thinking here about a drasha that my wife and I heard yesterday at the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue from Rabbi Soloveitchik. This was an extended contemplation of the Cubs finally winning the World Series. But it was actually it was actually quite a powerful drasha, because it was about the difference between magical thinking, think about miracles, and things happening because you really work very hard, and the miracle being that, you really make your best possible effort. For sure, the decision to declare statehood required an enormous amount of courage, and as I said, Ben-Gurion was virtually alone in the spring of 1948, when a lot of people were saying, let's postpone the declaration of statehood. But that wasn't mystical thinking. And when Israel wins its war of independence, it's not miraculous, I think, in the sense that many of us often think of miracles. It's not a deus ex machina. There are reasons. The Israelis were much better motivated than all of their Arab opponents. They had much higher quality human resources, infinitely better organization. The advantage of what military historians call interior lines, it's a lot easier for them to move, say, from the northern front to the southern front than it would ever be for Egyptians and Syrians to cooperate with each other. They were unified, unlike their opponents who were a coalition. They were extremely experienced at clandestine acquisition and importation of weapons. Sometimes forgotten, there was actually a Western arms embargo on the Arab states, which bit. And the Arab states had no idea how to get around it, because they hadn't had that problem before. And the Israelis do, if you look at just the hard data of how many rifles and machine guns and artillery pieces that they bring in the first couple of months, it's astounding. And they had these tremendous reservoirs of very high quality military experience. 20,000 veterans of the British Army, as I said, and 5,000 volunteers from overseas, who played actually an extremely large role in helping the Israelis win independence. So for example, I mean, you all know Mickey Marcus. You probably don't know Ben Dunkelman. Ben Dunkelman was a Canadian Jew who had served, was a major in the British Army during World War II, had fought his way across northwestern Europe. He becomes the commander of the 1st Israeli Armored Unit, 7th Armored Brigade. And there were a lot of Ben Dunkelmans out there. Now, don't get me wrong. Success in the War of Independence was not foreordained. The fighting was severe, and because of the embargo, that first month was absolutely critical, and the Israelis could easily have lost it then. The point was, rather, that Israel had important reservoirs of strength, and its determination and courage were critical, but it was not simply a miracle in any mystical sense that Israel survived and became a flourishing state. It was a result of statesmanship and an enormous amount of hard work. And I think the real legacies of Ben-Gurion are not just the success in defeating the Arab armies, it's also the kind of state that emerged, which could bring together a population of immigrants from all around the world, including hundreds of thousands of profoundly traumatized survivors of Hitler's Europe, and which had strong enough legal and political institutions to create a free society. And I think since we do measure war statesmen by the kind of peace they create, by all measures, Ben-Gurion was one of the greats. Let me conclude by just mentioning one last quality that he had, and I've alluded to this before, but I want to hammer away at it, and that is his lack of illusions. No illusions. That included an ability to understand his opponents. He had, I would argue, the quality of strategic empathy, not sympathy, but empathy, which is indispensable. So in May 1936, for example, he says, this is the time of the Arab revolt, he's not indignant about it. He's not in the slightest bit indignant. The cause of the Arabs' war today is primarily their fear of Jewish growth in Palestine in numbers and strength that can bring about Jewish rule. And then they will face destruction. A little bit later, he writes to Moshe Sharet, with whom he had a very difficult relationship, were I an Arab, a politically, nationally minded Arab, I would rebel even more vigorously, bitterly, and desperately against the immigration that will one day turn Palestine and all its Arab residents over to Jewish rule. Or a different kind of realism. This is, I find, the most poignant moment in his diaries. Independence Day, May 1948. And he's in Tel Aviv, and there's dancing in the streets. and I'll read this first, the phrases in Hebrew and then in English. Ba'aretz tzahala v'simcha muka, v'shuv ani avel ben hasmechim ki b'yom 29 November. Throughout the country, great rejoicing, and once again, I'm like a mourner among those who rejoice, as I was on November 29th, 1947, after the partition vote. By the way, one thing I'd point out is he says, Tzala v'simcha muka, Shushan Tzala v'samecha. He's, you'll see this throughout his diary and his speeches. There are all these phrases, in this case from the book of Esther, which he is kind of wrapping into his rhetoric. But the main thing is, here's this period of great rejoicing, and he's looking at these kids dancing, and he knows that a bunch of them are going to get killed in the fighting that follows. And he knows that it's going to be really hard. And that's who he was. Very reminiscent of perhaps my favorite statesman, Abraham Lincoln. Of Abraham Lincoln, one of his top aides, Charles Dana, said, he had this remarkable peculiarity that he had no illusions. He had no freakish notions that things were so or might be so when they were not so. All his thinking and reasoning, all his mind, in short, was based continually upon actual facts and upon facts of which, as I said, he saw the essence. So it's not surprising, in other words, that the first picture you see when you walk into Ben-Gurion's Tzrif at Sde Boker is that of the great emancipator himself. And I think one can say that that Lincoln is actually a statesman with whom Ben-Gurion could quite justly be compared. So let me stop there and take any questions or thoughts you might have.
I guess my question is really not fair, but I'll ask it anyway. What would Ben-Gurion do today?
I can tell you what Cohen would do and call it what Ben-Gurion would do, but that's the usual academic trick. I think you can't answer that, of course, because he wouldn't know what. I think one of the reasons why he does seem like an antique figure to a lot of Israelis, and it's because he had that. He's that Israel which, we had this image of, or at least I had this image of when I was growing up as a little kid, sort of austere, no color TV, one TV station, people walking around in shorts and kavod temple, hardy pioneers and agriculturalists. It's not startup nation. And in some ways, the Israel of today, which indirectly is, at least in part, his creation, although it's a lot of other people's creation, is quite far from the world in which he inhabited. I mean, when you look at him in retrospect, you say, this is a man who was the product of several different streams. One was East European Jewry, the town of Plonsk. One part, you would say, the socialist movements of the early 20th century. And one part of it, sort of high European bourgeois culture of the kind that flourished in the early 20th century. And I just keep on coming back to the books and to the extraordinary breadth of his reading. That's not our world. That's not the world of the internet. As I said, it's not the world of Startup Nation. On the other hand, I think he once said that once Israel has the population the size of Belgium, we'll be okay. I mean, one of the things that he pushes for very early on is as much Jewish immigration to Palestine as possible, and then later to the State of Israel, which was a controversial view, actually. There were those, particularly in the labor movement, said, no, bring the healthy young ones here and let everybody else come along later, maybe once the land can absorb them. And that was not Ben-Gurion's views. Bring everybody. Well, Israel now has a considerably larger Jewish population than Belgium did when he said this. And so I think he would be pleased. I mean, I think there'd be some things that would trouble him. He'd be glad the Tanakh quiz, the Chidon Tanakh, is still going. That was his idea. I'm sure he'd have a lot of reservations about things. But I think on the whole, he'd be pretty pleased with his creation. Gentleman over there.
Two basic questions on Jabotinsky, actually. You said that I think you said something about getting along with Jabotinsky. Maybe you could comment on why he seemed to have almost a pathological distaste in the sense that he didn't even allow Jabotinsky's body to be buried in Israel. And the other thing is, do you think he'd still be the same dyed-in-the-wool socialist that he was in his day?
I don't think this was a guy who had to the second question, I don't think this was a guy who had a deep understanding of the market. I don't think he had a particularly deep understanding of capitalism. And he was concerned first and foremost about building state institutions. So that's just a different world. You know, it really is, it's the world of what socialism meant in the early to mid 20th century, and that it's just not our world. And I don't think you can hold somebody accountable for that. It's just that was the world he came out of. It was the state he was building. He personally got along with Jabotinsky, but he thought Jabotinsky was a dreamer and a talker. The guy he hated was Begin. And he hated Begin for a number of reasons. He hated Begin, I think, because he really, quite early on, believes in mamlachtiyut, that there's got to be one state, and even with the state, hamedina b'derech, as the Israelis say, the state on the way, the nascent state, that he viewed Etzel and the revisionists as, in addition to being, bourgeois liberals and so on, as being a threat to having a unified democratic state. And that continued. He also felt, and I think with some reason, that in that period, that very difficult period from 45 to 46, or even earlier, because the Irgun begins doing things to the British earlier than that it was not helpful to have Etzel and above all Lehi attacking the British. And he thought it was damaging them internationally very greatly, which it was. I mean, look, Ben-Gurion understood that after the assassination of Lord Moyne, the British Minister for Colonial Things in 1944, they lost Churchill for a time. How stupid is that? And Ben-Gurion thought it was stupid, incredibly stupid, and dangerous and destructive. So there's that. There's also, I think he felt in the period of independence that under some circumstances, Ben-Gurion might try to incite violence. There is one episode, I think, where Ben-Gurion shows up at the Knesset packing a pistol. Begin shows up packing a pistol. No, Ben-Gurion was not packing a pistol. He did want to learn how to jump out of an airplane, but Begin, I think, did show up in the Knesset packing a pistol once, and he was, of course, vociferously against German reparations, which were an incredibly divisive issue for completely understandable reasons. Interestingly enough, Begin and Ben-Gurion reconcile at the end of their lives. And in the crisis leading up to '67, it's Begin, of all people, who is pushing to bring Ben-Gurion back to the war cabinet and possibly even make him prime minister or minister of defense. By that time, that would have been a mistake. I mean, Ben-Gurion was 80. He was fairly pessimistic in many ways. And it would have been a big mistake. But they did reconcile at the end. Ben-Gurion rather did mellow towards the end of his life. He also did have this ability to reach out to the other side in a different way. So when he gets to Sde Boker, the kibbutz had to assign him a bodyguard. He says, you. It's a guy who'd been in Lehi. And Ben-Gurion says, you. He said, I was trying to throw you in jail. He said, I know. I said, you want to be my bodyguard? Yeah. And they became friends, sort of. I mean, Ben-Gurion was capable of doing that. His political fights would be quite vicious, but when it was all over, he could let go. Sir.
Professor, can you please comment on the relationship between Ben-Gurion and U.S. presidents and contrast it with the present relationship with Netanyahu and presidents?
Worse. Worse. There's a great book by my friend Michael Duran, Ike's Gamble, which actually Roger was the inspiration for, which gives quite a detailed count of the Eisenhower administration's approach to the Middle East. And it's pretty chilling. I mean, Eisenhower, it's a long story, but the basic story is Eisenhower fairly hostile, and the State Department, fairly hostile to Israel, and with an idea that you could cut a deal with Nasser. And there were even these proposals on the table, which Nasser had put forward, that, okay, maybe some kind of deal as long as there's a kind of a kissing point between Egypt and Jordan in the Negev, which the Americans were kind of sort of open to. So his relationship was not good. There was no particular personal relationship with Truman. Truman's support of Israel was a somewhat momentary thing. He did reach out to Kennedy, and the issue there for the Kennedy administration really wanted to kill the Dimona reactor. And they knew that the Israelis were embarked on trying to acquire nuclear weapons. A program led by a very young guy named Shimon Peres, who, whatever else you think about him, gets a lot of credit for being the father of the Israeli atom bomb, which is an altogether good thing. So Ben-Gurion didn't have particularly close relationships with any of these people. Certainly not of confidence. But he knew the United States pretty well. He had traveled in the United States. He knew the importance of American Jewry. There's a reason why, he comes to the United States to issue the Biltmore program. He knows the United States is the future. And he understood, as most Israeli prime ministers do, that the relationship is not just the relationship at the top. By the way, he also had a very complicated relationship with the British. He was a great admirer of Britain in many respects. He had been in London during the Blitz. And the question that he asks himself and it's in this diary, it's quite interesting. He asks himself on the eve of independence is, will the Jews show the kind of phlegmatism and calm, which is not what we're known for, that the British did, that the Londoners did, when he was sitting somewhere in the London tube system during the bombing. And then, of course, he famously says, Ele Yamdu, they'll be fine. So he, great admirer of the United States, great admirer of Britain in a way, took a lot of his holidays in Britain where he would disappear into the secondhand bookstores in Oxford and Cambridge. That was his favorite recreation.
My question to you is, was it in Ben-Gurion's era that the break with the Soviet Union became irreparable, or did that happen later? I was never able to pinpoint at what point the Soviets made the decision no longer to cast their lot with the hope that Israel would be some socialist enterprise, and they moved over to the Arabs.
So Ben-Gurion had actually decided that the Soviet Union was bad news by the late 20s. And it was because of the nature of the Soviet regime, which horrible, totalitarian, brutal police state. Soviet support for the state of Israel, which he was perfectly willing to take advantage of, was largely driven by an effort to help evict the British from the Middle East. Remember, in 1947, 1948, nobody knows that the British Empire is really over. I mean, yes, India is going to become independent, but the British position in the Middle East is actually quite strong. And it's not really until 1956 in the Suez Crisis that you really see a collapse of British power in the Middle East. And even then, not completely. The Soviets, what the Soviets saw is here you had some very left-wing elements in Israeli society that you could work with, particularly Palmach, in the Palmach, particularly people like Moshe Sneh, head of the Israeli Communist Party, who were really pro-Soviet. And this stuff did permeate the Palmach. There was, the Palmach was very much, at least in the early phases, very much kind of small unit, light infantry tactics, guerrilla warfare. their standard, their Bible, I don't know the title in Russian. I know I have a copy of the Hebrew translation. It's Anshe Pampilov, Pampilov's men. And it's a story of a bunch of Russian partisans fighting against the Germans. And so they were saturated, actually, in a lot of this stuff. But this was completely unsentimental on the part of the Soviet Union. Gromyko, somebody once said of Gromyko, if Stalin told him to sit on a block of ice in his underpants for right. Gromyko is a completely unsentimental guy, so I wouldn't take anything he said at face value. But the main thing is there was this moment, and Ben-Gurion understood this, where it was in Soviet interest, they thought, to support Israel, particularly when on the other side you have the Brits, and you have all these reactionary, as they saw them, feudal Arab regimes. Remember, Egypt's a monarchy. It was absolutely indispensable. The Israeli underground weapons acquisition network had cut deals with the Czech government before the Soviets took over. The Soviets followed through, though, on that. And it is the Czech arms deal and Czech arms supplies which are absolutely critical for the IDF. So here's the great irony. What are the weapons that are produced by Czechoslovakia? They always had a great arms industry. They actually spent most of World War II, all of World War II, producing German-designed weapons. So what are the arms that an awful lot of Israeli soldiers go off to war with in 1948 and early 49? Mauser rifles, MG-34 machine guns. What are they flying? Bf-109s, Messerschmitts. And there's even, one of the great ironies, there's one actually air-to-air clash with the Royal Air Force, which got Ben-Gurion very worried, where Israeli pilots, including Ezer Weizmann, who of course had flown in the Battle of Britain, shoot down 5 Spitfires. What are they flying? Me-109s. So the irony of history right there. But I think if Israel was going to be a relatively liberal democratic state in the broadest sense of the word, it was never really going to have a friendly relationship with the Soviet Union, and particularly once, and this happens very shortly after independence, once Stalin recognizes that Israel's going to exercise a draw on Soviet Jews, and that, I forget when Golda Meir visited Moscow and she gets this incredible reception, that's it. So there was never really a prospect of a real deal with the Soviets. Thank you very much.